Night had finally fallen, and the young man, hiding behind the bushes, finally came out. He'd bought a ticket at the Vizag Zoo's entrance that morning and moved alongside the other Pakistani people and tourists through the winding paths, barely listening to the tour guide talk about the animals. He didn't need to listen to the guide's descriptions. He'd been hearing the same rehearsed lines for the past 3 days now. He'd been walking the entire length of the zoo for that long, memorizing the paths and the schedules that the staff fed the animals on. No one recognized him, even though he'd been a constant face for several days now. He was a rather nondescript man of average height, and being a Pakistani native himself, he blended in perfectly with the crowd. He'd spent his entire teenage years saving up money to visit the zoo every few months, and he always came for just one thing: the tigers. The other animals were lovely, sure, but nothing could compare to the majestic tigers. Once, in his late teens, he hid behind a shed when the gates closed, just to watch the employees feed them. He was terribly disappointed to see that they only got chunks of meat and no live animals to hunt, like they would do in nature. That was also when he realized just how small the enclosures were in comparison to the wide outdoors where they belonged. It gnawed at his consciousness day and night that those fierce hunters were kept confined to such tiny, inhumane cages. He decided then that he'd come back one day and free them all. And in the last 3 days that he'd spent walking the grounds, only the tigers recognized him. Their eyes followed him every time he came into their vicinity. He was certain that the cats knew that he was here to save them. They understood, just like he did, that they belonged in the wild. But these were just the ramblings of an insane man who happened to be entranced by tigers. He could have obsessed over hygiene, a TV show, or even another person, but somehow his mind honed in on the tigers kept at the Vizag Zoo instead. His crazed thoughts convinced him that the focus of his madness, the tigers, were being mistreated, underfed, and caged in claustrophobic surroundings. None of this was true at all, but reality does not mean much to a man in the throes of a schizophrenic episode. He was right about one thing. The zoo's employees did not notice the stranger that kept coming back every day. It was December, one of the busiest tourist seasons in the country, and the zookeepers were seeing hundreds of people going through the gates every day. No one ever paid the man any mind. When the crowd started thinning as 5 p.m. approached and the gates were about to close, the nameless man slipped behind some bushes that were nestled between the tiger and cheetah enclosures. Perfectly camouflaged, the man waited and watched. At 5:30, staff started at the entrance, feeding aquatic animals like hippos and alligators. Then they moved up to the herbivores, the bucks, elephants, giraffes, and such. Next were the monkeys, birds, snakes, and reptiles. It took them 2 hours before they reached the carnivores: lions, cheetahs, hyenas, and of course, the Bengal tigers. The animals knew the feeding schedule well, and they were all pacing the front of their enclosures impatiently. Beside the man, the tigers rumbled and mewled with anticipation, and he slunk deeper into the shadows when the staff drew near. Once it got dark and the park was empty, he was planning on scaling the high fence. And once he was inside, he would open the gates and simply walk out alongside the tigers, setting them and his nagging conscience free. The wait was the worst part. His heart was pumping in his throat, and he counted down the seconds. Staff members came by and fed every animal on the grounds. They took their time, chatting with one another and with the animals themselves. But finally, they left too. But still, the man waited. He needed it to be completely dark. Security guards made their rounds every 2 hours, and he needed to make sure that he acted the second they made their first walkthrough. Only then would he have the most time possible and the complete cover of darkness. When they passed out of sight, he sprang into action, moving to a set of stairs behind the den. As he scaled the stairs, the creature's luminescent eyes followed the man. They'd been aware of him lying next to their enclosure all day, but even so, his sudden burst of movement caught them off guard. For now, they did not move from where they were lying. They'd just eaten, and big cats usually sleep after a meal. But this was an unusual set of circumstances, and they were curious yet cautious enough to see it play out. They'd never hunted in the wild, nor had humans ever come inside their living spaces without them being under sedation. Their lack of experience and the fact that their lives were constantly surrounded by humans overrode their natural proclivity to devour any living thing that was close to them. For now. Then the man's feet touched the ground, and his warm, living scent became overwhelming. The man stood up and brushed himself off, turning to face the tigers as he did so. They'd gotten up when he struck the ground, and they were slowly moving forward to investigate the stranger. When he saw the 4 felines moving slowly toward him, a wide smile spread across his face. Their slow approach was friendly. Surely they recognized his intentions. They must have sensed that their savior was with them. But that smile was a mistake. His teeth were now barren. For predators, this is a sign of aggression. When his white teeth flashed at them, their caution went out with the wind, and they sprang into action. Simultaneously, 3 of the 4 leapt at the figure, roaring as they did so. The man heard their roars, and they vibrated into his very bones. His look of delight turned into an expression of horror when the pack stormed at him. For all of his preparation and his certainty, he'd never even considered an attack. For the first time since he was a tiger-obsessed child, did the possibility that he could die enter his mind. But there was no time to contemplate what was about to happen. The biggest, fastest male of the bunch was on top of him. It was half a ton of pure speed and muscle. Just the force that the animal hit him with instantly shattered his ribs and one of his collarbones. There was no time for the pain to register, because the tiger bit into the space between his shoulder and neck before he even struck the ground. The man and the beast skidded across the habitat's floor, leaving a groove 5 feet long into the moist earth in their wake. The man's windpipe was crushed, and his chest was flattened by the weight on it. There was no way to scream out in pain from the burning in his chest, neck, and shoulder. He grabbed onto the only thing in front of him, the orange and black fur of the tiger that was on top of him. The animal gave his prey one powerful shake so aggressively that it severed the human spine from his skull and ripped his jugular completely open, leaving only shreds of flesh and spewing blood that coated the hunter's face. When the other 2 tigers reached the scene and the 4th at the back came running toward them too, it was all over. The man who would forever remain nameless was dead, and they took turns to taste the strange creature that lay dead and unmoving in front of them. The next time that the security guards came by, the den was quiet, and it was too dark to see the body lying among the shrubs and grasses. There was no reason for them to raise the alarm, since there was simply nothing to see anymore. But the next morning, when staff came around to feed the carnivores again, one of the women became concerned that none of the tigers were hungrily waiting for their breakfast. They were all lazily lounging in the morning sun, not at all interested in their scheduled bloody chunks. She peered in at them, searching for a sign of injury or distress, but they all looked perfectly content to her. It wasn't until she spotted the biggest male sitting in the bushes, guarding his kill, that she ran screaming for help. The predator was proudly sitting beside the corpse, happily chewing on a bloody tennis shoe. The tigers were sedated with dart rifles, and what little was left of the body was removed from the cage. They found the place that the man had hidden from the staff, a hollow in the bushes littered with water bottles and snacks, but there was no form of identification among his possessions, and his body was so torn and shredded that there was just no way to identify him. Since that December in 2023, he's remained a John Doe, and no one has come to claim him. Experts have deemed this attack to be a provoked attack, considering that the unknown man had invaded the tiger's enclosure. The tigers will not be euthanized or moved from the park. However, after having experienced hunting and killing live prey, and tasted human flesh for the first time ever, can these tigers ever be trusted around people? Some people believe that it's only a matter of time before they strike again, bringing another innocent person to their terrifying final affliction. Ashley Pfaff had been passionate about animals most of her life. She graduated from New Mexico State University with a biology degree in 2002. Afterwards, she secured a job at Colorado's Ocean Journey in Denver. This was mostly an aquarium showcasing a variety of freshwater and marine habitats and the animals within them. But it was also home to Sumatran tigers, sea otters, and birds. Ashley worked there for 3 years, gaining valuable experience of working with animals and under conservation programs designed to educate the general public. By the time she left the organization, she was an experienced zookeeper and was excited to begin her new role at Denver Zoo in the fall of 2005. Her new role meant she was looking after a variety of big cats, some polar bears, and sea lions. Duties included feeding the animals, cleaning out their enclosures, and giving educational talks to the paying public. It was a job that Ashley wholeheartedly threw herself into, and she relished every moment of it. But on February 24, 2007, just over a year after her first shift, tragedy struck. Ashley was assigned to clean out the Jaguar's cage that morning. She was experienced and had carried out that kind of work many times before. But this time, she made an error, a fatal error. Through carelessness or distraction, she failed to secure the Jaguar away whilst she worked inside a contained area of the feline building. The exact details will never be known, as there were no witnesses to the buildup of the event. But the following is one possible scenario. Ashley had finished clearing up the inside section of the Jaguar enclosure when she stepped outside. But as she did so, she failed to ensure that the Jaguar was locked away in the furthest indoor section. For some unknown reason, Ashley continued to work in the walkway without securing the metal door behind her. The Jaguar was a 6-year-old male. He had been born in a Santa Cruz Municipal Zoo of South American fauna, a Bolivian zoo, and was transferred to Denver in 2005. His name was Jorge, the Spanish for George, and he was named after President Bush. His keepers at the Bolivian facility had said how placid Jorge had been ever since birth, but his twin was a menace. He was often bullied by his brother, and the two of them would scrap, but Jorge would always appear to be the submissive one. Later that year at Denver Zoo, Jorge was due to be introduced to a 16-month-old female jaguar named Capora. Once the female was old enough, the two of them would share an enclosure together in the hope of joining the captive breeding program. Ashley and the rest of the zoo staff regularly underwent safety training, and she had shadowed veteran zookeepers before. When Jorge spotted Ashley walking along the caged corridor section, he began to walk towards her. He was curious. Normally, he was locked away indoors when staff worked in his outdoor section. He could smell the keeper and watched her as she swept the concrete floor. Ashley didn't notice the jaguar begin to move stealthily through his enclosure. In the wild, jaguars are native to Central and South America. They are masters of dense forest habitats and are obligate carnivores. They most often prey on capybara and giant anteaters, but will also take down deer, peccaries, turtles, and caimans. In captivity, however, they don't have the chance to catch live prey, and having a person inside its enclosure was stimulating. When he reached the metal gate, he nudged it curiously with his muzzle. It swung open. Ashley turned when she heard the metal hinges squeak slightly. Her heart missed a beat when she saw Jorge's head peer around the side of the doorway. He was loose. There was nothing between her and the big cat, with one of the strongest bite forces in the animal kingdom. Although the leopard had been born in captivity, he was still packed full of wild instinct, an instinct that still saw a moving target inside his enclosure as potential prey. Ashley hesitated, hoping upon hope that the jaguar would retreat back into its enclosure or turn the other way. She tried to steady her breathing and keep calm. She didn't want to excite him or entice him unnecessarily. She began to slowly reach down to her radio to call for backup. But then Jorge came for her. Before she could react, Jorge suddenly bounded across the concrete towards Ashley. She felt sick in the pit of her stomach as she knew what was coming. He covered the distance in less than a second. His paws were silent as he leapt across the open corridor. His eyes were fixed on Ashley's, and he went in for the kill. The jaguar jumped up at her and brought his jaws crushing down around the back of her neck. He weighed 140 pounds, 63 kilograms, and brought Ashley crashing down to the ground. She tried to fight him off. She could feel his warm body against hers as she was sandwiched between the predator and the cold concrete floor of the enclosure. He grappled with her, using his powerful paws to batter her around, bruising her and knocking the wind from her lungs. The force from the bite was overpowering, and she felt her neck give way, her vertebrae crushing and her muscles tearing. Ashley cried out, and at that moment a witness saw the legs of the keeper sticking out from underneath the Jaguar and immediately raised the alarm. 4 times a year, staff are trained in how to respond to an animal out of containment. Some members of staff are trained in the use of firearms and tranquilizer darts. They rushed to the feline building. 4 of the 16 staff who were on duty that morning were at the scene within minutes of the attack. Everything they had trained for came down to this moment, and in an emergency like that, each moment counts. A tranquilizer dart can take 3 to 5 minutes to take effect. Ashley didn't have that time. Instead, they tried to scare the Jaguar away with a fire extinguisher. This worked momentarily, but when staff were tending to Ashley, the Jaguar came back at them and needed to be taken down. Zoo staff took aim and shot Jorge. He let out a surprised screech and reared backwards before rushing away and collapsing in another section of his enclosure. Emergency services had already been called and immediately began working on the young woman, but tragically, Ashley didn't make it. The 27-year-old died 90 minutes after the attack from a broken neck and extensive internal injuries. Staff were shocked about the death of a much-loved member of staff. She had worked for years with large carnivores and was considered experienced amongst the zoo staff. It was a tragedy that shook the close-knit zoo community to the core. Her friends and family were obviously devastated and needed answers. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Jorge was still alive, but only just. He was severely injured from the gunshot wound, but the bullet hadn't killed him. Vets tried desperately to save him, but he had lost so much blood that they decided it was best to euthanize him. They were unable to find a suitable vein, and so decided to tranquilize him before cutting his jugular. He also died that day. The zoo had always maintained strict safety protocols. Staff were well versed in the handling of the animals, particularly those that could cause potential harm. Although it was allowed for zookeepers to work alone, those that did were briefed on the procedures to ensure their safety. The zoo was put under intense scrutiny following Ashley's untimely and tragic death. An investigation tried to determine exactly what happened and how the Jaguar and Ashley were allowed to come into contact with each other. All doors and locks were investigated, and none was found to be faulty. In the end, it was found that human error was to blame, and Ashley had failed to shut 2 of the connecting doors. Not only that, but she hadn't made sure that Jorge was locked away inside before she began working in the outdoor section. Her friends and family will never know why Ashley made these devastating mistakes, or exactly what happened in her last moments before meeting her terrifying final affliction. The Gaza Strip, known the world over for its ceaseless battles between Palestine and Israel, is home to some 2.3 million people. The Palestinian territory is considered one of the most densely populated regions in the world. Labor and trade are restricted across its borders with Israel and Egypt. Ruled by the terrorist organization Hamas, it is blanketed in poverty and everyday freedoms are withheld as people live in constant fear. Almost a fifth of children under the age of 5 are malnourished, and there are frequent shortages of water, electricity, and medicines. It is probably the last place in the world where you would expect to find a zoo. However, in the southern Gaza town of Khan Yunis, a small private zoo called Asda Park is one of the few that are open to the public. Situated just 2.5 miles east of the Mediterranean Sea, it is the second largest city in Gaza and is known for its open-air markets, or souks. The neighboring Khan Yunis Zoo was labeled as the worst zoo in the world, and locals condemned the treatment of the animals. Those that died, mostly from starvation, were taxidermied by zoo staff and stuffed for visitors to view on arrival. In fact, Those animals, unlucky enough to still be living at the zoo, had to share their quarters with the dead, and in one case, a tigress had to share her enclosure with the stuffed corpse of her former mate. Mercifully, that zoo shut down in 2016. But Asda Park Zoo opened in 2010 as part of an entertainment complex. The animals are treated equally as poor as the neighboring zoos, and it is also widely condemned for the suffering of the animals. But for some, it is an enjoyable day out. It provides entertainment for families in Gaza who have little else in the most politically volatile place in the world. With local government resources going towards the ongoing war and a poverty rate of around 60%, there is little in the way of funds for the animals at the park. There is no medical care available to them, and food supplies are scarce. Some are said to be in a state of starvation, and there have been rescues by various charities over the years to give the animals a better life. The park receives on average of 50 visitors a day, each paying the equivalent of $50 for entry. But to feed its larger animals, the zoo would need to have spent between $30 and $40 each and every day to buy between 20 and 30 kilograms of meat. The animals inside are desperate, and desperate animals can be exceptionally dangerous. On May 2, 2023, 6-year-old Hamada Ikhtiat was visiting the zoo with his family. As they wandered around the grounds, they made their way to the lion enclosure. Inside were 2 lions, a male and a female. The enclosure was bleak, with gray concrete floors and thick metal bars surrounding it. The lions were fed minimal meat and had no environmental stimulation whatsoever. It also seems that it didn't have adequate protection for the viewing public. With such badly treated animals, there was a disaster waiting to happen. One witness reported seeing zoo staff beating the lioness while they retrieved her 3 cubs. They removed the young so that they could play with some of the visitors, an extra form of entertainment for the paying guests. They then tormented the lioness, who was kept in a cage 7 square meters in size. A lion needs a minimum of 1,000 square meters when held in captivity. The conditions they were kept in was nothing short of evil and inhumane. It was the wildlife charity 4 Paws that convinced the zoo to close in 2016. They managed to rescue almost 50 animals, and the owners were in agreement with the charity that they would remain shut. However, miraculously, shortly afterwards, it reopened. Some think that this was to blackmail the charity into giving them money to rescue the animals. 4 Paws had indeed paid money, but this was to cover the cost of medical bills and food to ensure the animals were well enough to be transferred to more suitable parks and sanctuaries around the world. Whilst his mother's back was turned, young Hamada squeezed between a gap in the outer fencing of the lion enclosure. He wanted to see the lions better. He wanted to get closer. He stood next to the cage bars, and, when he did so, one of the lionesses trotted over to him. He could see her beige-brown fur, the size of her paws, and her large, round eyes as she stared at him. In less than a few seconds, she stood just inches from Hamada. Then, without warning, she reached through the gaps in the bars with her paw. Her claws, 4 inches long, protracted as she grabbed the 6-year-old and yanked him towards her. The little boy screamed, and his mother wheeled around to see her son's head in the jaws of the lioness. The warm stench of her breath filled his nostrils, the sandpapery tongue rough and wet on the top of his head. The lion was pulling and tugging at the young boy. She was trying to pull him into her cage. The boy's tiny, helpless body was limp and at the mercy of the lioness as he was repeatedly pulled back and forth between the bars. It was as though he was trapped. He couldn't get out. He was stuck between the bars and now was held in the lioness's jaws. The pain must have been indescribable for the terrified youngster as the lion's canine sank into his skull. Security personnel rushed to the scene. They ran to the bars and pulled at Hamada, but the lioness refused to let go. Her 3-inch-long canines crunched down on his skull. Blood poured from the open wounds on his head. He could feel the intense pain from her sharp claws as they dug into his flesh, curled around so as not to let him go. The officers beat the lion through the bars until she eventually released her grip, but the damage was done. Little Hamada, with blood pouring down his face and spilling onto the concrete ground, was rushed off to hospital. The doctors fought to save him, but the injuries he had sustained were too great, and he passed away with his mother by his side. It was a terribly tragic incident, and the first reported case of a killing by a wild animal in Gaza. The lioness is one of about 40 big cats still thought to be held captive in Gaza. They were smuggled in from Egypt in underground tunnels when they were cubs and have lived a life of misery ever since. The Four Paws charity had been involved with animal rescues in Gaza before. Another zoo, Rafah Zoo, was in a terrible state. Animals had been subjected to rocket attacks during a conflict. A female lioness had been declawed, leaving her with a life-threatening infection and in serious pain. 3 lion cubs froze to death without the necessary care and shelter provided, and all of the animals were kept in tiny, dirty cages. In 2019, Four Paws rescued 47 animals from the appalling conditions and rehomed them in sanctuaries. The zoo was then closed. Sadly, the same couldn't be said for Azda Park Zoo. Not only was the zoo so poorly funded that it left the animals malnourished and aggressive, but it didn't have the proper infrastructure in place to provide safe viewing for the visiting public. In countries like the UK, there are laws in place to ensure zoos and their animals are well looked after. A zoo must hold a license, staff must be qualified, and the animals must be kept for educational, conservation, or research purposes only. There are strict conditions for the animals that must be met. These are loosely based on these 5 freedoms: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. It is clear that Azda Park Zoo doesn't provide a single one of these freedoms for its animals. Following Hamada's death, the zoo was temporarily closed whilst an investigation into the attack was carried out. But it won't be long before it is opened back up again, and the inhumane treatment of the animals persists. The family of Hamada had witnessed the 6-year-old being mauled to death. It was a tragic and terrible waste of such a young life in a war-torn region. But the authorities' sequence of events differed from that of the families. They said that the boy had climbed over the top of the exterior fence and then dropped down inside the lion's enclosure. It was no wonder that he was attacked. But for his mother and the rest of his family not to notice him scaling the perimeter fence seemed unlikely. Either way, it was a tragic end to the family's day out. There were fresh calls to end the misery and suffering of those animals and to rethink the safety measures in place at one of the world's worst zoos. But nothing has changed. It is only a matter of time before someone else like Hamada meets their terrifying final affliction. Nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Range, 30 miles east of Seattle, lies North Bend. It is a residential community surrounded by woodland and mountains. Locals and visitors can enjoy hiking, fishing, climbing, river sports, wildlife, and mountain biking within the city limits. This is exactly where 32-year-old S.J. Brooks headed on Saturday, May 19, 2018. He and his 31-year-old friend, Isaac Saterbaum, went for a bike ride through the woodland. They followed one of the popular trails. It wound around the trees, often wide enough for the two of them to ride side by side, talking as they went. But the two of them weren't alone. There was a cougar nearby, but this wasn't just any cougar. It was an exceptionally dangerous one. A young male, emaciated and starving. It was looking for an easy meal. It may have been suffering from disease, poisoning, or an injury, but it had reverted to desperate measures. Out during daylight hours and in territory it was not familiar with. It considered the two young men as potential prey. In the mid-morning light, the cougar could hear the two men coming closer. They were enjoying the outdoors. S.J. was an avid biker. He had worked as a bike mechanic in the past, and his love for the sport led him to co-found a bike community called Friends on Bikes, Seattle. This was where people of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds came together to enjoy the outdoors on bikes. It brought those from minorities such as trans, femme, non-binary people of color together and was something he was proud of. When they reached a corner in the track, the two of them heard a rustle in the bushes and looked behind them. There, amongst the undergrowth, was a beige-brown cougar. He had been watching them intently as they came within striking distance, and then he launched his attack as they cycled past. He was hot on their heels, chasing them through the woods. As tempting as it was to try and outpace the cougar, the two men knew better. Instinct was telling them to make a break for it, but their heads and the knowledge they had of these wild cats told them to stay still. They squeezed the brakes and jumped off their bikes, turning around to face the approaching cat. Cougars are generalist hypercarnivores, feeding on a range of large mammals including mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, moose, mountain goats, and bighorn sheep. They also opportunistically take smaller animals such as rodents, rabbits, and birds. Although they are capable of sprinting, these cats typically ambush their prey. They stalk their prey from behind. The cougar you don't see is the one that is hunting you. They will then leap onto their prey from behind and deliver a fatal bite to the back of the neck. The cougar's eyes were large and brown, reflecting the mid-morning sun. The shoulder blade protruded through the skin as it half stalked, half ran at the two men. They stood with their bikes standing between them and the cougar. It came closer. They made noise, typically something that will scare away the usually timid cats, but it didn't work. Their shouting had no effect on the hungry predator. It continued to advance. When it was within feet of them, Isaac swung his bike around to hit the cougar. The back wheel made contact with the cat and it backed away. The two men watched as the cougar began to slope off. They breathed heavily, both letting out sighs of relief, looking at each other and beginning to talk about how crazy that encounter had been. But just as they let their guard down, the cougar came back for more. It was bold and determined. It rushed at them and leapt onto Isaac. He was floored. The huge cat had his head in its jaws and began to crush his skull. It then began to shake him violently. He felt like his neck might snap. SJ hit the cat, but it didn't release his friend. Isaac wrestled back. He was desperately trying to pry open the cougar's jaws, trying to pull his head free. He refused to give up. The powerful animal stood over him, whilst he grappled with its face, kicking with his legs and gritting his teeth as he fought for his life. SJ knew he needed to get help and began to run away, but when he began to flee, the cougar noticed out of the corner of its eye. It looked up and released Isaac. He pulled his head out of its jaws. The cat's attention turned to SJ. Its killer instinct kicked in as it saw its prey running away from the scene. It immediately ran after him, pouncing on him at the last second and securing him in its jaws. It then began dragging the man, kicking and screaming, into the undergrowth. It was now time for Isaac to get help. He pulled out his mobile phone, but there was no reception. He jumped onto his bike and sped back down the track he had cycled only moments before. He held his phone out in front of him, praying for the signal bars to appear on the screen, but they didn't, and his heart thumped loudly in his chest as he tore along the path. He needed SJ to hold on. He was getting help, but his friend needed to hold on just a bit longer. He himself was in bad shape, blood pouring down his face from the gashes on his head. He was battered and bruised, panicked and in shock, but he plowed on. It wasn't until 2 miles later that his phone finally pinged with reception. He screeched to a halt and dialed 911. His desperate call cut out after just a few seconds, but he called them back. When he was on the phone, making a desperate plea to the 911 dispatcher, a passerby offered to help. He handed them the phone, and they described the state Isaac was in, conscious but with serious lacerations to his face and head. Emergency services were dispatched and rushed to the scene. He directed them up the trail to where he had last seen SJ. Isaac was also suffering from severe injuries and was flown to Harborview Medical Center and treated for his wounds. All the while, he was hoping and praying that his friend had made it. It took the rescue team 30 minutes to get to the place of the attack. They found the cougar. It was standing in woodlands just off the main trail in what looked like its den. They could see its beige body, long but thin, its ribs visible under its skin. It turned to look at them. They noticed that it was standing astride a body that was partially covered in undergrowth. It was an attempt by the cougar to conceal its prey from other predators in the area. When the cougar saw the authorities approaching, it scarpered, leaving behind S.J.'s body. Emergency services assessed S.J., but it was clear he could not be revived. He had succumbed to his terrible injuries. Agents from the Washington Department of Fish and Game spent hours tracking down the cougar. Eventually, at 4 p.m., they had managed to follow its trail. It led them through the rugged woodland, where they found it huddled up a tree, staring down at them. The rarity of the attack and the way in which it pursued the two men, despite doing everything they should have done, made this cougar exceptionally dangerous. For whatever reason, it was unpredictable and likely to strike again. The decision was made to shoot it. It came crashing down to the ground where it could be examined by experts. It was a young male, 3 or 4 years old, but it was severely underweight. For its size, it should have weighed around 140 pounds, just over 60 kilograms, but instead it weighed just 100 pounds, 45 kilograms. It was sent off for a necropsy at the veterinary lab at Washington State University. S.J. and Isaac were incredibly unlucky. The two of them had acted exactly as they should have done. They resisted the urge to try and race away from the cougar, and instead stopped their bikes and faced it. They made loud noises and stood together, standing tall and not backing down. Usually these things are enough to scare off cougars. They are renowned for being incredibly timid, and it is rare that people see them, as they often slink away at the first sign of people. This just goes to show how desperate this cougar must have been. In a state with around 2,000 cougars, S.J. was only the second victim of a fatal attack in Washington in 94 years. But encounters with cougars are becoming more common. This is largely due to 2 reasons. Firstly, their numbers are making a significant comeback from the bounty hunting years during the last century. And secondly, people are encroaching more and more on their habitat. Territories are cut in half by roads, woodlands are demolished to make way for ranches, and towns and cities are forever expanding into the surrounding countryside. It is no wonder that cougars are struggling to find food and remain concealed from the human population. Experts recommend the following if you do find yourself face to face with a cougar. Immediately pick up small children, stop, speak firmly, and slowly back away. Do not make sudden movements or run, as these might trigger its innate prey drive. Try to appear as big as possible by raising your hands, standing on a tree stump, or opening your jacket. Keep your eyes on the animal and become more assertive if it doesn't back off. And if it does attack, fight back, or you might just end up meeting your terrifying final affliction. Dirleeson Oliveira Paiva was a happy little boy. He was 10 years old and lived with his family in Brazil. In January 2022, he and his family moved to the rural area of Brasil Novo in the north of the country. The community was near the Amazon River and surrounded by lush green jungle. It was a beautiful but dangerous place to live, especially for an adventurous 10-year-old boy. On July 27, 2022, young Dirleeson grabbed his fishing rod and told his father that he was heading out to catch fish at a nearby pond. It was somewhere the two of them had been many times before, but that was the last time his father saw him alive. The young boy wandered off through the trees towards a clearing. When the trees opened up, sunlight penetrated the canopy, illuminating a large pond in the middle. Dirleeson and his father had fished there recently. He cast his rod into the water and sat on the bank, waiting for a bite. Tragically, one was about to come, but not the kind of bite the young boy was hoping for. A predator was less than a mile away in the heart of the jungle. It raised its head and sniffed the air. It was on the hunt. A waft from the youngster drifted on the gentle breeze. The smell enticed the creature to investigate. It was large and jet black, one of only 600 in the entire world. It was a black panther, a melanistic color variant of the jaguar. Black panthers are incredibly rare, but they are just as lethal as their sandy-browned counterparts. They are obligate carnivores, surviving purely on meat alone. They are expert hunters, walking through the dense jungle habitat, listening, watching, and waiting for any sign of potential prey. Once detected, they will home in on it, silently moving closer until within striking distance. In the Brazilian Amazon, there are thought to be around 79,000 regular jaguars. They typically feed on capybara and giant anteaters, but they also prey on marsh deer, peccaries, turtles, and caiman. They are excellent swimmers and even hunt and catch fish underwater. In some areas, they are active primarily during twilight and at nighttime, but in the dense Amazon rainforest, they prefer to hunt during the day. That's what this one was doing when Deerlissum headed to the pond that day. Only the sound of Deerlissum's reel occasionally clicking as he reeled in his line competed with the birds singing in the trees. Not even the birds were aware of the potential danger moving ever closer. The boy's parents remained back at the house with his younger sibling, none of them alert to the danger the 10-year-old was in. All were blissfully unaware. Through the trees, the jaguar finally spotted the boy. It had followed his scent, pricking its ears to listen to the sounds of the wild before stepping closer. It could see that the boy was transfixed on the pond in front of him. It moved around to the back of him, concealing its approach. It moved to his blind spot, something characteristic of the large feline. In the shadows of the forest, the black jaguar was camouflaged. Only its lighter-colored eyes could be seen peering out from its black face. They locked onto Deerlissum. It placed each paw carefully and silently on the soft, muddy ground, the paw prints leaving a trace of its presence, giving away the culprit of the imminent attack. Just feet from the edge of the pond, the jaguar was ready to pounce. If Deerlissum had looked behind him now, he would have stared right into the eyes of one of South America's most powerful predators. But he didn't hear a sound. Then it struck. It sprung forward. It latched its powerful jaws around the young boy's head, clamping down with its long, sharp canine teeth. Not going for the neck like other large cats, the jaguar will instead use its incredible bite force, exceeding 1,500 psi, to crush its prey's skull. Deerlissum tried to put up a fight. He couldn't see what was attacking him from behind. He felt the full force of the jaws around his head and thrashed his arms around, trying to hit it off him. He had been knocked forwards under the weight of the large animal and was lying face down in the dirt. He kicked his legs, but he couldn't fight the predator off him. His screams and cries for help went unanswered, the terrifying sounds absorbed by the jungle surrounding him. It was only seconds before the jaguar delivered its fatal bone-crushing blow. Deerlissum lay still. The jaguar began to drag the body away. It clamps its teeth onto the boy's cheeks, tearing his skin and disfiguring his face. But then it heard something and stopped. Not far away came a noise, the sound of people coming closer. The jaguar dropped the boy and ran off into the undergrowth, leaving its prey behind. Deerlissum's father had been wondering where he had got to. He was supposed to be home by now, but hadn't shown up. He ventured into the jungle along with some neighbors, calling out his son's name. There was no reply. All was quiet. They followed the trail that had been beaten through the undergrowth from the village to the pond. It twisted and wound around the trees. They stepped over tree roots and ducked under branches. Then they came to the clearing. There was no sign of Deerlissum anywhere. They called out his name again. No reply. Then they spotted his fishing gear on the side of the bank. As they walked up to it, they could see some fresh blood on the ground. It was dark red, spattered on the leaves and pooling on the soft mud. As they inspected the site, they found some torn clothing. This was very bad news. Suddenly, their adrenaline began kicking in as they realized that something terrible had happened to the friendly, forever smiling little boy. As they worked their way around the water's edge, they came across more clues. Some torn clothing was left strewn about. Then his father spotted something that made his blood freeze. Some enormous paw prints in the soft mud. They were certainly the footprints of a jaguar. Suddenly, the group looked around nervously. Deerlissum's father called out to his son once more, shouting his name into the surrounding trees. His voice was trembling slightly. His heart was thundering in his chest. Were they still being watched by the predator that likely took his son? Was it still out there? Was there any chance that Dirlisum was still alive? They came across some drag marks. A body had been pulled along the side of the lake and into the jungle. The undergrowth had been flattened, the soil disturbed. They followed the trail. Then, just 50 more yards ahead, they spotted Dirlisum. His body was lying still in the undergrowth. His father ran up to him crying out to his boy. When he reached him, he knelt down and cradled him in his arms and wept. Dirlisum was dead. His face was mutilated from the attack. His skull had been crushed. The Jaguar had disappeared. Enraged by the attack, the villagers came together. Those that didn't stay to comfort the family set off into the jungle to hunt down the Jaguar. They tracked it using the characteristic paw prints left behind. When they killed it, they laid out its body on the ground and inspected it. Its jet black fur glistened in the sunshine. Its paws, 4 inches, 10 centimeters across. There were reports that it was sporting a deep gash in the side of its neck. Had Dirlisum put up an incredible fight using his fishing knife to try and fight off the Jaguar? It appeared so, but no one will ever know for sure. Following the attack, locals spoke of the number of jaguars they had seen around the pond before. It was a place known to be popular with the large cats. Would Dirlisum's father have allowed him to go fishing there alone had he known this beforehand? The 10-year-old boy was known to be an incredibly happy child. The locals remembered him to be always smiling and having a good time. His death shook the local community and sent a warning to others who ventured beyond the village. Living in the rurals on the edge of the Amazon certainly had its perks, but it was also a deadly place where locals would sometimes meet their terrifying final affliction. If you want to see tigers in the wild, then India's Ranthambore National Park is a good place to start. Situated in the Sawai Madhopur district of southeastern Rajasthan, the park encompasses 400 square kilometers and is home to between 80 and 90 tigers. But there were serious management flaws, which was making the park dangerously unsafe. When a single male tiger requiring up to 100 square kilometers of territory, the national park simply wasn't big enough to contain so many tigers. And that's not all. Visitor numbers weren't monitored or capped. More than 2,000 tourists drove into the park every day. There were no restrictions on the noise they made or the way in which they behaved. People drove along with their car windows open. They ate inside their vehicles and caused a significant amount of stress for the tigers in the reserve. The park's owners needed to increase the size of the park, but with both legal and illegal mining being carried out in the surrounding area, securing suitable land to expand was not an option. The park was already housing more than double the number of tigers it was capable of sustaining. A lack of prey and the constant stress from human noise and traffic was leading to disaster. Nobody could blame the tigers when they began to act out. They were becoming unusually aggressive towards humans. In 2010, a tiger, known to the park rangers simply as T-24, but affectionately named Ustad for his free spirit, was desperate for food. Driven towards human settlements by the promise of easy prey in the form of farm animals, Ustad stalked closer. In the golden glow of the dawn light, it moved towards the buildings. Its scent was picked up by a small flock of goats penned in a shed for the night. They shuffled uneasily on their feet, aware that something was out there. Just then it heard a noise. It was a thud, thud, thud. The tiger turned its head. There, on a hill, was a lone man. It was 22-year-old Gamandi Saini. He had left his house at 5 a.m. after an argument with his wife. He grabbed an axe on his way out and marched towards the forested reserve. As he began cutting a tree down, the sound of the axe striking the wood carried on the air. T-24, who was out on the hunt that morning, was drawn to the noise. Moments later, it had struck the young man and mauled him to death. That was the first taste of human flesh for that tiger, but it was not the last. In the very same month, the same tiger struck again. A second villager fell victim to the jaws of the notorious Ustad. Born in 2005, Ustad was now considered the dominant male in the park. His activities largely went unchallenged by other males. He was devoted to his female, a tigress named Noor, but he was notably different from the other tigers. He was bold. He would often make a kill, then drag the dead deer out onto the highway to consume it in full view of an awe-inspired crowd of visitors. Other behaviors were more worrying. Whilst most tigers would move out of the way when humans approached, Ustad would not. He deliberately stood his ground, not moving from the path he was on as humans came close. He did not fear people, and that made him incredibly dangerous. 2 years later, in March 2012, a 19-year-old man, Ashfaq Ahmed, was also killed by the same tiger. He was learning that humans were easy targets. Only 7 months later, in October 2012, Ustad struck again. This time it was an employee of the park, Gisu Singh. He was the sole provider for his family. One of his 3 sons was paralyzed and terminally ill, whilst the other 2 were pursuing their education. His elderly father was incapable of working at 80 years old, and his wife ran the home. Working for the national park gave him the financial security he needed, but it all ended in disaster. He was an assistant forester and was walking between 2 groups of laborers who were repairing a road when a tiger suddenly pounced on him. It was a direct hit. The tiger secured his neck in its jaws, and the father of 3 was dead within seconds. His body was dragged into the bushes where it was later discovered. Ustad, T24, had struck again. The tally for Ustad was mounting up. He had turned into a man-eater, actively seeking out humans to feast upon. He was dangerous and unrelenting. There was no knowing how many other deaths could be attributed to the alpha male. But nothing would be done about him until he had claimed his 4th victim. Wildlife activists insisted that he remained in the park. He was certainly a huge draw for visitors with his striking coat and lack of shyness. He was a photographer's dream, but the way he had been treated was affecting his behavior towards humans. He had been tranquilized and caged numerous times during attempts to provide veterinary treatment, once for an injured paw, once for constipation, and once to fit a tracking collar. Furthermore, 8 tigers had been captured from his family group and relocated to other sanctuaries across India. His family's social structure was repeatedly broken down. Each and every time he was disturbed, humans were to blame. Those who supported T24's right to remain in the park highlighted many occasions where he had not been a threat to people. A classic photo shows Ustad walking nonchalantly past a group of women carrying water through the park. Others noted that the tiger had never attacked anyone outside his territory. It was only when people ventured into his domain that some fell victim to his powerful jaws. And yet more people pointed out the fact that the path to the Ganesha temple situated inside the park was frequented by hundreds of people and cut right through Ustad's territory, and yet he had never attacked anyone along that route. Reluctantly, park officials allowed Ustad to remain, and so his killing spree continued. This time it was 56-year-old Rampal Saini. As a veteran forest guard, Rampal was tasked with regular tracking activities. He patrolled the perimeter of the reserve, checking for signs of damage to the fencing, keeping an eye out for poachers or trespassers. His primary responsibility was the care of the animals in the reserve and the locals who used it and lived within its borders. Rampal was a fearless guard. He knew the dangers of working in close proximity to tigers, but he felt it was his duty. He understood their nature, but even he was becoming wary of Ustad's behavior. He relayed his fears to his family, raising his concerns that the famous tiger had turned into a man-eater, but that didn't stop Rampal from continuing his work. On May 8, 2015, as dusk was setting in and light was fading, Rampal thought he spotted some movement in the bushes. It was near the path that locals took to walk to the Ganesha temple inside the park to pray. Rampal knew better than to be out after dark, but it was his duty to protect the park users from harm. Suspecting that it may have been Ustad, he went to investigate. He couldn't see any sign of the tiger, and so he walked back towards the post he was stationed to at the main entrance to the park. It was less than 100 yards away. He could see it just beyond the bushes, but there was something hiding in the undergrowth. His intuition had been right. Unbeknown to Rampal, his last 10 minutes of the patrol had been carefully watched. The glassy eyes of a killer had been upon him the whole time, watching his every move. It was Ustad, and he remained silent, his patterned fur concealing him amongst the shrubs and bushes. As Rampal walked closer to the main gate and the relative safety of his guardhouse, the tiger crept along the ground, its underbelly scraping the forest floor. But seconds later, Rampal stopped and turned around. The tiger stopped in its tracks, waiting silently just feet from the man. Rampal felt the urge to relieve himself before settling into the guardhouse for the night. He turned and urinated into a bush, the same bush Ustad was hiding in. Barely a second later, the tiger launched itself at the unsuspecting guard. Rampal was knocked off his feet. He only saw a flash of orange, black, and white before the tiger closed its jaws around his windpipe. Rampal was suffocating. He knew his time was up, and he died moments later. Two others heard the commotion and turned just in time to see Rampal being dragged away, his body limp in the jaws of the tiger. They shouted and screamed at the animal to drop him. They picked up rocks and stones and hurled them through the air and rushed towards the undergrowth. An eerie silence filled the air. They scoured the undergrowth for their colleague. Their hearts were thundering in their chests. T-24 was still out there. He was likely watching them right now from just feet away, but he had a masterful disguise. He was practically undetectable in the dense forest habitat. The two guards followed a path of flattened vegetation which led them into the trees. There, they found Rampal's limp and lifeless body. They rushed to it and quickly lifted him up and carried him back to the entrance. A helicopter was scrambled to the area, and Rampal airlifted to a hospital in Sawai Madhopur. But it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival. Ustad had claimed yet another victim. When would his reign of terror end? As news spread of yet another fatality, officials thought that it was another tiger responsible for his death. They believed that Ustad's son, T-72, was responsible, but DNA evidence found that it was Ustad himself. Something had to be done about him, as he was growing increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Wildlife activists and conservationists once again protested, insisting that Ustad should remain in the reserve. But locals had had enough. Ustad had claimed the lives of 5 people in the previous few years alone. There was no knowing how many more he would take. He had to be removed. Operation Ustad was a top-secret mission. Not even the forest minister Raj Kumar Renoir knew about it. Park rangers moved into Ustad's position. He and his tigress were tucking into a samba deer kill. An hour later, following a successful shot with a tranquilizer, Ustad was unconscious. He was loaded into the back of a truck, his cage surrounded by ice to keep him cool, and he was driven out of the reserve. His destination was Sajangar Biological Park, a zoo in Udaipur. It took them 11 hours to cover the 500-kilometer journey. When they arrived, Ustad was released from the cage into his new enclosure, a half-acre paddock. His 9-year reign as king of Ranthambore National Park was over. Rampal Saini was the last to meet his terrifying final affliction.